Snow hammers the Vermont mountains. In a whiteout storm, a mother stumbles uphill, one child fading in her arms, four more clinging behind her like shadows. Her boots are soaked, her breath is running out, and the river she fled is already swallowing the place they once called home. A single cabin light flickers through the snow. Inside, a retired Navy SEAL sits alone by the fire, convinced the world has already taken everything worth saving. One knock breaks the silence. On the porch stands a woman who will not beg, only wait. Between life and death is one wooden door, and the man who must decide whether to open it. What happens next will remind you that sometimes survival isn't about strength. It's about choosing to let someone in. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no mother or child should ever face the storm alone, subscribe now and share this story with someone who still believes in second chances. Vermont had a way of turning quiet into something dangerous. That winter night, the mountains outside the small rural town were swallowed by snow so thick it erased distance and direction alike. Roads disappeared first, then fences, then the subtle shapes that usually told a traveler where safety might be found. Streetlights flickered weakly at the town's edge before giving up entirely, leaving only darkness, wind, and the steady hiss of falling snow. The temperature had dropped fast, far below what most people were prepared for, and the storm had no intention of easing before morning. It was the kind of night when sensible people stayed indoors, and the kind of night that punished anyone who could not. She was already deep into the storm when the town lights vanished behind her. The woman moved warily, step by step, her boots soaked through, her breath coming out in shallow, uneven bursts. She was in her early 30s, though exhaustion made her look older. Her face was narrow, skin pale and raw from the cold, dark strands of hair escaping the loose knot at the back of her head. Snow clung to her eyelashes and melted along her cheeks, leaving streaks that looked too much like tears to be comfortable. She carried a child in her arms. The boy could not have been more than 3 years old. His small body was wrapped in a thin blanket that had once been blue, now faded and stiff with moisture. His head rested against her chest, his breathing shallow enough that she kept adjusting her grip, just to be sure he was still there. Every few steps, she tilted her face downward, listening for the soft sound of air moving in and out of his lungs. Behind her walked the others, 4 children, the oldest no more than 10, the youngest barely old enough to keep her balance. They moved without speaking, their faces red and numb, hands buried deep in sleeves that were too short for them. They had learned not to complain. Hunger, cold, and fear had already taken that instinct away. Instead, they watched their mother's back and followed it, trusting that as long as she kept moving, they should too. The woman's name did not matter yet. What mattered was that she did not stop. She had already stopped once that night, hours earlier, standing in the doorway of what used to be their shelter, water creeping across the floor, icy and silent. The river nearby had risen too fast after days of relentless snowfall, and the ground beneath the small structure had given way without warning. She remembered the way the cold had climbed her legs as she waded back inside to grab the children, the sound of wood groaning under pressure, the smell of damp rot and fear. That was when she knew they could not stay. She had not packed carefully. There had been no time. A blanket, a bag with a few papers, shoes pulled on without socks for 2 of the children. She told herself she would fix it later. That later was still an option. Survival often depended on believing, small lies like that. Now, later had arrived, and it was worse than she imagined. Her legs burned with effort. Her arms ached from holding the child, but she did not shift him to the ground. The snow was too deep, and she was afraid he would not stand again if she set him down. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the storm itself were pressing against her shoulders, testing her resolve. She did not think in long sentences anymore, only fragments. Warm, light, keep going. Then she saw it. At first it looked like nothing more than a trick of the snow, a faint glow blurred by the wind. She stopped walking, heart hammering, afraid that hope itself was playing a cruel joke. She blinked hard, wiped her face with the back of her glove, and looked again. The light remained. It came from higher ground, where the trees thinned and the slope leveled out. A cabin, she realized. Small, isolated, but intact. A single window glowed amber against the white void, steady and stubborn, as if it refused to be erased. Her chest tightened. She did not rush forward. Experience had taught her caution. Doors did not always open just because you needed them to. Sometimes they stayed shut, no matter how cold the night was outside. Sometimes people looked at you and decided your need was too complicated, too risky, too inconvenient. Still, she gathered the children closer and moved uphill. By the time she reached the porch, her hands were trembling uncontrollably. She set the boy gently onto a wooden bench, adjusted the blanket around him, and turned to face the door. The wood was thick, weathered, scarred by years of wind and snow. It looked solid. It looked like it had held against worse than this. She raised her fist and knocked, not loudly, not desperately, just enough to be heard. Inside the cabin, the sound cut through a silence that had been heavy for a long time. Ethan Cole sat in a wooden chair near the fire, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the flames. He was a tall man with a broad frame that suggested strength, even at rest. His dark hair was streaked with gray far earlier than age alone would explain, and his beard, trimmed but uneven, shadowed a jaw marked by old scars. One faint line ran along his cheekbone, another disappeared beneath the collar of his sweater, reminders of places he no longer talked about. At 38, Ethan looked like someone who had learned discipline young and never quite learned how to let it go. The cabin had been his retreat, his shelter from a world that felt too loud, too crowded, too full of questions he did not want to answer. After leaving the Navy, after the war ended but refused to stay behind him, he had come here to disappear quietly. Vermont offered isolation without judgment. The trees did not ask where he had been. The snow did not care what he had done. The knock froze him in place. His body reacted before his mind did, muscles tensing, breath steadying, senses sharpening as if he were back in a place where hesitation cost lives. The sound came again, followed by the muffled cry of wind. He stood slowly and moved toward the door. When he opened it, cold air rushed inside, carrying snow and silence with it. For a moment, he saw only white. Then shapes formed. A woman, pulling rigid with exhaustion. Children clustered behind her. A small boy slumped on the bench, unmoving. Ethan did not speak, neither did she. They looked at each other, two strangers brought together by a storm that did not care who they were. Ethan took in the details automatically. The way the woman stood straight despite shaking hands. The way her eyes, dark and steady, did not beg. The way the children watched him, not with fear, but with careful hope. He stepped back. Just one step, but it changed everything. The woman lifted the boy into her arms again and crossed the threshold. The children followed, one by one, boots leaving wet prints on the floor. Warmth wrapped around them slowly, the fire crackling softly as if acknowledging their arrival. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the door closed behind them, and something shifted, quietly, permanently, in the small space they now shared. The door shut with a soft, final sound. It was not dramatic. There was no slam, no rush of words, just the dull thud of wood against its frame, followed by the steady howl of the storm now locked outside. Snow continued to strike the windows, but it felt distant, muted, as if the world beyond the cabin had been placed behind glass. For a few seconds, no one moved. The fire crackled low in the hearth, its light flickering across unfamiliar faces. The woman stood near the door, still holding the boy, her shoulders tense, as if she expected to be pushed back out at any moment. The children hovered close to her, forming a tight cluster that spoke of long practice. They did not explore the room. They did not speak. They simply waited. Ethan noticed all of it. He had spent years training himself to observe without reacting. In the Navy, awareness had been survival. Now, even in this quiet cabin, that instinct remained. He saw the way the woman's hands trembled slightly, not just from cold, but from the sudden absence of it. He saw the way the oldest child positioned himself half a step forward, as if prepared to intervene if something went wrong. He saw the exhaustion etched into every movement. What he did not see was manipulation. That mattered to him more than he liked to admit. "Put him down by the fire," Ethan said finally. His voice came out rough, unused, like a door hinge that hadn't been opened in a long time. The woman flinched slightly at the sound, then nodded. She crossed the room carefully and lowered the boy onto a thick rug near the hearth. Ethan crouched beside them, adding another log to the fire, coaxing the flames higher. Warmth spread slowly, unevenly, like a promise that needed time to be kept. The boy stirred once, a soft sound escaping his lips, then settled again. Ethan exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath. The woman straightened, her movements stiff. Up close, he could see more clearly now. Her face was drawn, but composed, cheekbones sharp, lips pale. Her eyes were dark, watchful, not unfriendly, but cautious. She looked like someone who had learned that kindness could disappear without warning. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, unembellished, spoken not as a plea, but as an acknowledgement. Ethan nodded once. He didn't trust himself to say more yet. He gestured toward the table. "Sit, all of you." The children obeyed quickly, boots lined up near the wall without being asked. It struck him how practiced they were, how used to being told where to stand, where to wait. It reminded him uncomfortably of younger versions of himself, learning structure before understanding why. Ethan moved through the cabin with deliberate efficiency. He retrieved blankets from a chest near the bed, handing them out one by one. His hands were large, calloused, scarred in places where skin never quite healed right. They were hands that had held ropes, weapons, wounded men. Now they passed wool and fabric, awkwardly gentle. The woman wrapped the blankets around the children, tucking them in as best she could while standing. She worked quickly, automatically, her body running on muscle memory, even as her mind lagged behind. "You can sit too," Ethan said. She hesitated, then lowered herself onto a chair near the fire. For the first time since entering, her posture loosened slightly. The tension did not vanish, but it shifted, settling deeper, as if her body was deciding which worries could wait until morning. Ethan watched her carefully. There was a moment, long ago, that had changed him forever. It was not the firefight itself, not the noise or the chaos, but the aftermath, the quiet after. The realization that once the immediate danger passed, what remained was something heavier: responsibility, memory, the faces of those who depended on you. That weight pressed against his chest now. "You came from the river," he said, more statement than question. The woman looked up at him, surprised, then nodded. "It flooded, faster than we expected." Her voice did not shake when she said it. That scared him more than if it had. "How long were you out there?" he asked. She considered the question. "Long enough." That was the answer of someone who had learned that exact numbers did not matter. Ethan turned away, opening a cupboard. Inside were a few cans of soup, a small bag of rice, powdered milk, stored for emergencies he had always assumed would only involve himself. He set a pot on the stove and filled it with water, movement steady, controlled. The cabin filled slowly with the smell of heat and metal and something like comfort. The children watched him now, not openly, but from the corners of their eyes. He felt their attention like a physical presence. He had been stared at before, by recruits, by enemies, by men who expected him to lead. This was different. These eyes were measuring safety. He did not know how to answer that expectation. The water warmed, Ethan knelt near the boy again, checking his breathing. It was shallow but steady. The firelight danced across the child's face, making him look younger, more fragile than before. The woman noticed Ethan's focus and spoke quietly. "He's been like that since the cold got worse." Ethan nodded. "He needs warmth, fluids. We'll start there." She studied him, really looked at him for the first time. His posture, the economy of his movements, the way he did not fidget or rush. Something in his presence shifted her expression. Not relief exactly, but recognition. "You've done this before," she said. Ethan paused. "Different situations," he replied. He did not elaborate. She did not press. The soup finished heating. He poured it carefully into chipped bowls, thinning it with water so it would be easier to drink. He handed them out, showing the children how to hold them near the fire without spilling. The smallest one burned her tongue slightly and made a soft sound of protest. Ethan reacted instantly, setting the bowl down and blowing gently across the surface. His brow furrowed in concentration. "Slow," he said, more to himself than to her. The woman watched him closely now. There was something almost disarming about the way this large, scarred man handled small, ordinary problems with such care. It did not erase her fear, but it complicated it. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, time slowed. After the children finished eating, exhaustion overtook them quickly. One by one, they drifted into sleep, bodies curling toward the heat, breaths evening out. The woman remained awake, eyes tracking each child until she was sure they were truly resting. Only then did she allow herself to lean back. Ethan sat across from her, the fire between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with things unsaid. Finally, she broke it. "I won't stay long," she said. "Just until morning." Ethan met her gaze. "You'll stay until the storm passes." It was not an offer. It was a decision. She searched his face, perhaps for signs of anger, or expectation, or regret. She found none of those. What she found instead unsettled her. He looked tired in a way she recognized, not just physically, but deeply, the way people looked when they had carried too much alone for too long. She nodded. The fire burned steadily as the night deepened. Snow piled higher against the windows. Somewhere beyond the cabin walls, the world continued to test its limits. Inside, a former soldier and a mother who refused to stop walking sat quietly, bound together by a single shared truth. Neither of them spoke aloud yet. This night had changed something, and there would be no going back to who they were before the door opened. Morning did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, reluctantly, as if the night were unwilling to let go of what it had claimed. The storm weakened first. The wind lost its sharpness, its roar fading into a low, restless murmur. Snow still fell, but softly now, drifting downward instead of attacking sideways. The cabin windows turned from black mirrors into pale sheets of gray. Ethan noticed the change before he realized he had not slept. He sat in the same chair by the fire, his boots still on, his shoulders stiff with fatigue. Years of training had taught him how to remain alert through long nights. But this kind of vigilance felt different. There had been no perimeter to secure, no radio to monitor, no clear enemy to anticipate. There had only been breathing, small, uneven breaths that mattered more than any objective ever had. Across the room, the woman slept upright in the chair, her head tilted forward, hands resting loosely in her lap. Exhaustion had finally taken her, not gently, but completely. Her face looked softer in sleep, less guarded. Lines of tension remained around her eyes, but they no longer held the sharpness of fear. She trusted the room enough to let go. That, Ethan thought, was no small thing. The children lay scattered on blankets near the hearth, bodies angled toward the warmth, limbs tangled together in ways that suggested long familiarity. They slept deeply, the kind of sleep that only comes when the body has nothing left to give, all except one. The boy closest to the fire, the youngest, the one his mother had carried, was awake. Ethan noticed it immediately. The child's eyes were open, unfocused, his breathing shallow and uneven. Each inhale came with effort, his small chest lifting too quickly, dropping too fast. His skin looked pale, almost gray in the early light. Ethan was on his knees beside him before his thoughts caught up. He placed 2 fingers lightly against the boy's neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, but weak, too fast. The boy's lips parted as if to cry, but no sound came out. Instead, he shivered, a deep, involuntary tremor that ran through his small frame. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He had seen this before, not in children, not like this, but the signs were familiar. Exposure, dehydration, shock, the kind of condition that looked deceptively quiet before it turned dangerous. He glanced toward the woman, still asleep. Waking her abruptly would not help. Panic wasted energy, and energy was something they could not afford to lose. Ethan stood and moved toward the stove, filling a kettle with water. He worked quickly but carefully, aware of every sound he made. The cabin was still, the only noise coming from the fire and the faint creak of wood adjusting to the cold. As the kettle warmed, Ethan returned to the boy, adjusting the blankets, lifting him slightly closer to the fire without risking overheating. The child's eyes fluttered, unfocused, searching for something. "Stay with me," Ethan murmured, the words slipping out before he had time to question them. The woman stirred at the sound. She lifted her head slowly, disoriented, then saw Ethan kneeling by her son. In an instant, she was fully awake. She stood, crossing the room quickly but quietly, dropping to her knees beside them. "What's wrong?" she whispered. Ethan did not soften the truth. "He's struggling. He needs fluids, and more than I can give him here." Her face tightened, fear flashing through her composure like a crack in glass. But she did not panic. Instead, she placed a hand gently on her son's chest, feeling the rapid rise and fall. "How bad?" she asked. Ethan met her eyes. "Bad enough that we shouldn't wait." The kettle whistled softly. Ethan poured warm water into a cup, mixing in powdered milk. Testing the temperature carefully, he dipped a finger in, nodded once, then held the cup near the boy's mouth, coaxing small sips. The child swallowed weakly, some of the liquid spilling down his chin. The woman wiped it away with the edge of her sleeve, her hands steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "I thought he'd get better once he slept," she said quietly. "So did I," Ethan replied. They worked in silence for several minutes, the rhythm of care taking over. The boy drank a little more, then sagged back against the blankets, exhausted. His breathing remained shallow, but steadier. Ethan straightened slowly. "There's a wildlife and emergency rescue center about an hour from here," he said. "Cedar Ridge. They handle medical cases and conditions like this. There's a vet there, a doctor. Her name's Sarah Mitchell." The woman looked up. "A vet?" "She treats animals mostly," Ethan said, "but she's trained, and she's handled hypothermia cases before. She's the closest professional help we have." The woman hesitated, then nodded. "Call her." Ethan moved toward the phone, mounted on the wall. He had not used it in weeks, months, maybe. He picked up the receiver, the weight of it strangely heavy in his hand, and dialed from memory. The line rang twice. "Cedar Ridge Rescue," a woman's voice answered. Calm, clear, alert. "This is Sarah." Ethan took a breath. "My name is Ethan Cole. I'm up near the North Ridge. I've got a child here. Exposure, dehydration. He needs help." There was no pause on the other end. "I'm on my way," Sarah said. "Keep him warm. Fluids if he can take them. Don't overheat. I'll be there as soon as I can." The line clicked dead. Ethan lowered the receiver slowly. "She's coming," he said. The woman exhaled, a sound that seemed to release something she had been holding back since the storm began. She nodded once, pressing her forehead briefly against her son's blanket. An hour later, the sound of an engine cut through the quiet. Ethan stepped onto the porch as a dark green Jeep pushed its way up the snow-covered path. The vehicle stopped near the cabin, and a woman climbed out, pulling her hood back as she moved. Sarah Mitchell was in her early 30s, tall and lean, with a build that suggested endurance rather than strength. Her auburn hair was pulled into a practical braid, strands escaping around her face. Her skin was fair, flushed pink from the cold, freckles visible across her nose and cheeks. She moved with purpose, her posture upright, her gaze steady and observant. She carried a worn medical bag over one shoulder. Inside the cabin, she knelt beside the boy without hesitation, her movements efficient but gentle. She spoke softly as she worked, her voice even, reassuring, the kind that did not waste words. "He's cold," she said after a quick assessment, "but he's fighting." The woman's shoulders sagged slightly at that. Sarah looked up at Ethan. "You did the right things. Let's keep going." As daylight strengthened outside, the fire continued to burn, and for the first time since the storm began, something fragile but unmistakable took hold in the room. Hope. Not loud, not certain, but present. And for Ethan, that was enough to change the shape of everything that would follow. Night returned quietly, as if embarrassed by the damage it had caused the evening before. The wind no longer howled, but it had not left either. It moved around the cabin in slow, testing circles, pressing against the walls, rattling the shutters just enough to remind everyone that warmth was temporary. Snow drifted down in soft layers, erasing the tracks left by Sarah's Jeep, sealing the world off once again. Inside, no one slept. Sarah Mitchell knelt beside the boy, her medical bag spread open on the floor like a small island of order. She worked with practiced efficiency, but there was nothing rushed in her movements. Every action had intention. Every pause had meaning. Up close, Ethan noticed things he hadn't earlier. Sarah's hands were steady, but not rigid. Her fingers bore faint scars, old cuts that came from animals who had panicked, from fieldwork done without perfect conditions. Her face, illuminated by firelight, showed concentration without hardness. She looked like someone who had learned to stay calm, not because chaos didn't scare her, but because fear wasted time. The boy lay between them, wrapped in layers of blankets, a makeshift heating pad tucked beneath his back. His breathing was shallow but more regular now, his small chest rising and falling in fragile rhythm. The woman, his mother, sat just behind Sarah, close enough to reach out but careful not to interfere. Her posture was rigid again, as if rest were no longer permitted. She had tied her hair back more tightly now, strands smoothed away from her face, an unconscious attempt to regain control where she could. Sarah glanced up at her. "He's responding," she said softly. "That's a good sign." The woman nodded, but did not smile. Hope, for her, had learned to stay quiet. Ethan stood near the stove, heating more water, his presence constant but unobtrusive. He had offered help twice already. Sarah had accepted both times without ceremony, handing him supplies, asking him to hold the boy steady while she checked vital signs. It was a strange familiarity, this wordless cooperation. He recognized it instantly. This was how teams functioned under pressure. Clear roles, no ego, no excess words. Only this time, the stakes felt different. "You can sit," Sarah said without looking up. "We're stable for now." Ethan shook his head. "I'm fine." She did look at him then, really looked. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his weight shifted subtly from foot to foot, as if he were still braced for impact. "You won't be if you don't," she said. Not unkindly, just fact. He hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair across from the fire. The wood creaked under his weight. He leaned forward, forearms resting on his thighs, hands clasped loosely. From this angle, he could see all of them, the boy, his mother, Sarah, caught in the same circle of light. The cabin felt smaller now, but not claustrophobic. Intimate. Every breath mattered. The boy stirred suddenly, a faint whimper escaping his throat. His body tensed, fingers curling weakly. The woman moved instantly, placing her hand on his arm. "I'm here," she whispered. Sarah adjusted the blankets, checking his temperature again. "He's cold, but not dropping," she said. "That's what we want." "How long?" the woman asked. Sarah considered her answer. "A few more hours like this, then we'll know which direction he's going." The woman nodded, her jaw tightening. Waiting had always been the hardest part. Hours passed slowly. The fire needed tending. Ethan rose to add wood, his movements quiet. Sarah continued her checks, recording numbers in a small notebook, her handwriting neat despite the uneven surface. The woman did not move from her spot. She had not eaten. She had not asked for water. Ethan noticed but did not comment yet. There came a moment, deep into the night, when the boy's breathing faltered. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't watching closely. Sarah caught it immediately. "Ethan," she said, calm but firm, "I need more warmth, now." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence, bringing another heating pad, layering it carefully, adjusting the fire's intensity. His hands moved without hesitation, muscle memory taking over. The boy gasped once, then again. The woman's composure cracked. She reached for him, then froze, unsure where to place her hands, afraid of doing harm. Her breathing quickened, shallow and fast, mirroring her son's struggle. Sarah looked up sharply. "Stay with me," she said, to the woman, not the child. "He needs calm." The woman swallowed hard and nodded, pressing her lips together. Her eyes never left her son's face. Ethan felt something shift inside him. This feeling, this helpless vigilance, was painfully familiar. He had knelt beside wounded men before, counting breaths, waiting for signs, bargaining silently with anything that might be listening. He had learned to live with the outcome when those signs did not come. But this was different. This time, he wanted the outcome to change him. "Come on, kid," he muttered under his breath. "Stay." Minutes stretched into something shapeless. Then the boy's breathing deepened. Just a fraction. Enough to notice, enough to hope. Sarah exhaled slowly. "There," she said. "That's it." The woman sagged forward, her forehead resting against the edge of the blanket. Her shoulders shook once, twice. She did not cry loudly. She simply released the tension she had been holding since before the storm began. Ethan looked away, giving her privacy. He focused on the fire, the way the flames bent and straightened, endlessly resilient. "You've done this before," Sarah said quietly. Not accusing, not curious, simply stating a truth. Ethan did not answer immediately. "Yes," he said finally. "Different uniform." She nodded. "Same weight." He glanced at her then. She met his gaze evenly. There was understanding there, but not pity. He appreciated that more than he expected. Later, when the boy slept again, deeper this time, Sarah leaned back against the wall, stretching her legs carefully. "He's not out of danger," she said, "but he's fighting." The woman lifted her head. "He always does." Sarah smiled faintly. "I believe that." Ethan cleared his throat. "You can stay," he said to Sarah. "Storm's supposed to pick up again." "I planned on it," she replied. "I don't leave cases halfway." The woman looked between them, something cautious and grateful passing through her expression. "I don't know how to thank either of you." Sarah shook her head. "You already are. You trusted us." That mattered. As the night wore on, exhaustion settled into everyone's bones. Ethan's eyelids grew heavy, but he forced them open. He had slept through worse. But eventually, without warning, his head dipped forward, his body betraying him. He dreamed briefly of snow, of firelight, of doors opening. When he woke, the cabin was quiet. The boy slept peacefully. The woman had moved closer, her hand resting protectively on her son's chest. Sarah sat with her back against the wall, eyes closed but alert even in rest. Ethan realized something then, something simple and unsettling. He was no longer alone, and for the first time in years, that thought did not feel like a threat. Outside, the storm pressed on. Inside, 3 adults kept watch over a single fragile life, bound together by a night that demanded everything they had left, and revealed something they thought they'd lost. Morning arrived without ceremony. There was no sudden burst of sunlight, no dramatic clearing of the sky. The storm simply loosened its grip and stepped back, leaving behind a pale, washed-out world that looked exhausted by its own violence. Snow clung to the trees in uneven layers, branches bent low under the weight. The air outside the cabin felt different, still cold, but calmer, as if it had spent its fury and had nothing left to prove. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. Ethan woke with a dull ache in his neck and shoulders, the kind that came from sleeping in a chair without meaning to. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. That happened sometimes. His body knew how to wake fast, alert, ready, but his mind lagged behind, sorting through time and place. Then he heard it, breathing, small, even, steady. He opened his eyes fully and looked toward the hearth. The boy slept on his side, wrapped tightly in blankets, one small hand curled near his face. His color looked better now, still pale, but no longer gray. His chest rose and fell with a rhythm that no longer felt like it might disappear at any second. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Sarah sat on the floor nearby, her back against the wall, knees drawn up slightly. Her eyes were open but unfocused, the way they got when someone had been awake too long and was still refusing to surrender. A mug of cold tea rested forgotten beside her. "You can stop watching him like he might vanish," she said quietly, without turning her head. "He's stable." Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of his beard. "Habit." She glanced at him then, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Yeah, I figured." Across the room, the boy's mother slept on the floor beside her son. One arm curved protectively around him, her body angled in a way that allowed her to feel his breathing, even in sleep. Her face looked different in the morning, light, softer, less carved by tension. Still tired, but no longer braced for immediate disaster. Ethan stood and moved quietly to the window. He pushed aside the curtain and looked out. The world beyond the glass looked fragile, almost unreal. The storm had erased every hard line, smoothing everything into white and gray. There were no tracks, no signs of movement. It was the kind of stillness that felt earned. Behind him, Sarah shifted, stretching carefully. "She hasn't moved all night," she said. "Didn't sleep much before that either." Ethan nodded. "She won't until she knows he's safe." "Even then," Sarah replied, "she probably won't fully relax." He turned to look at her. "You see that a lot?" "All the time." She leaned her head back against the wall. "Parents who live in crisis mode, their bodies forget how to stand down." That landed closer than Ethan expected. The mother stirred then, lifting her head slowly. Her eyes went immediately to her son. She watched him for a long moment, as if afraid that looking too directly might undo whatever fragile balance had been achieved. "He's breathing," she whispered. "Yes," Sarah said gently, "and better than before." The woman nodded, pressing her lips together. Her hands trembled slightly as she brushed a strand of hair away from her son's forehead. "Thank you," she said. Not just to Sarah, to both of them. Ethan shifted his weight. Gratitude made him uncomfortable. It always had. Sarah stood and moved toward the small table, checking her notes. "We'll need to keep monitoring him today," she said. "Fluids, warmth, no stress." The woman looked up. "Can we stay?" The question was cautious, carefully phrased. Not entitled, not desperate, just honest. Ethan answered before Sarah could. "Yes." The word surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. She searched his face, perhaps looking for conditions, for an expiration date. She found none. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time. Breakfast was simple. Soup warmed slowly, a bit of bread Sarah had brought with her the night before. The children woke one by one, groggy and confused, blinking at the unfamiliar surroundings. It took them a moment to remember where they were, to recalibrate. Ethan watched them closely. The oldest boy took in the room quickly, eyes sharp, assessing exits and adults with the seriousness of someone far older than he should have been. The younger ones stayed close to their mother, hands clutching fabric, voices hushed. Ethan handed out bowls carefully, reminding them to eat slowly. His tone was firm, but not unkind. The children responded instinctively, recognizing authority without fear. That, too, unsettled him. As they ate, the woman finally sat back in her chair, the tension in her shoulders easing by degrees. She watched Ethan as he moved around the cabin, noting how he avoided sudden gestures, how he positioned himself so he could see everyone at once without making it obvious. "You're used to keeping watch," she said quietly. Ethan paused, then nodded. "It's hard to turn off." She considered that. "I don't think I'd want to." Sarah looked between them, sensing something forming, but choosing not to interrupt. Later, when the children were settled again, Sarah stepped outside to check her vehicle and make a call. Ethan stayed inside with the woman, the fire crackling softly between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, she said, "You didn't have to open the door." Ethan looked at the fire. "No." "But you did." "Yes." "Why?" The question was not accusatory. It was curious, almost careful. Ethan thought about lying. He could have said it was instinct, or responsibility, or simple decency. Those answers would have been acceptable. They were also incomplete. "Because I know what it's like," he said finally, "to be on the other side of a closed door." She nodded slowly. "So do I." Their eyes met, and in that moment there was no past or future, only recognition. Sarah returned shortly after, brushing snow from her jacket. "I've arranged for supplies to be delivered later today," she said. "Medical basics, food." The woman looked overwhelmed. "That's more than we expected." Sarah smiled gently. "Survival often is." As the morning wore on, light strengthened outside, filtering through the frost on the windows. The boy slept peacefully, color returning slowly to his cheeks. The cabin felt warmer, not just in temperature, but in something harder to define. Ethan realized that the silence no longer felt empty. It felt shared. He stood at the window again, watching the snow melt into thin streams along the glass. For years, he had come to this place to escape connection, to avoid the weight of needing and being needed. Now, that weight had found him anyway. And, unexpectedly, it felt like something he could carry. By midday, the light had changed. It was no longer the pale gray of survival mornings, when everything felt tentative and borrowed. The sun pushed weakly through the clouds, catching on the snow in uneven flashes that made the world look sharper, more real. The storm had not apologized, but it had stepped aside. Inside the cabin, life began to rearrange itself. The children sat on the floor near the table, drawing shapes in the thin layer of condensation left on the wood. Their voices were still quiet, but no longer hushed. Laughter had not returned yet, but curiosity had. That felt like progress. Ethan noticed these things without trying. He had spent years learning how to live with minimal impact, how to take up as little emotional space as possible. Now the cabin resisted that instinct. There were too many people breathing, too many small sounds filling the air. It was impossible to disappear. Sarah stood near the counter, repacking her medical supplies. In daylight, she looked younger than she had the night before. The harsh shadows were gone, revealing freckles across her cheeks and a faint crease between her brows that suggested someone who thought deeply, often about other people's problems. Her auburn hair had slipped partly out of its braid, catching the light in warm copper strands. "The boy's improving," she said quietly to Ethan, "slowly but steadily." "That's good," he replied. "It is," she agreed. Then, after a pause, "But he'll need monitoring for a while, weeks, not days." Ethan nodded. He had expected that. Sarah glanced toward the woman, who sat at the table with her children clustered around her. In daylight, the woman looked smaller somehow, her frame slight beneath layers that no longer hid how thin she was. Her posture remained upright, but there was less tension in it now, as if she had finally allowed herself to believe the ground might hold. "She needs options," Sarah said. "Not just a place to recover, but a plan." Ethan followed her gaze. "She hasn't asked." "No," Sarah said. "People like her usually don't." That truth sat heavily between them. The woman, Ethan had learned her name was Maria, stood a few minutes later and approached them. Her movements were deliberate, careful not to intrude. She had tied her hair back again, dark strands pulled into a low knot at the nape of her neck. In better circumstances, Ethan thought, she might have looked younger than her years. There was quiet strength in her bearing, worn but unbroken. "I don't want to overstay," Maria said. Ethan turned to face her fully. "You're not." She hesitated. "We can move on once my son is stronger." Sarah spoke before Ethan could. "That would be a mistake." Maria stiffened slightly, defensive instinct flashing through her eyes. Sarah noticed immediately and softened her tone. "I don't mean morally," she said. "I mean medically. The cold alone could undo everything we've stabilized." Maria looked down at her hands. "We don't have many places left." Ethan felt that sentence land somewhere deep. He cleared his throat. "You can stay here. For now." Maria looked up sharply. "For how long?" The question was not demanding. It was careful. It carried the weight of someone who had learned that vague promises were often the first to disappear. Ethan thought about it. He thought about the quiet he had cultivated here, the solitude, the rules he had built for himself. No attachments, no complications, no reasons to stay awake at night, worrying about anyone else's breathing. Then he thought about the night before, about the way the cabin had felt when the door closed and did not open again. "As long as it makes sense," he said. Maria searched his face, trying to interpret the words. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you," she said. Again. But this time, the words sounded different, less urgent, more settled. Sarah exhaled. Softly, relief flickering across her expression. "I'll coordinate with Cedar Ridge," she said. "Supplies, check-ins. Eventually, we'll need to talk about longer-term solutions." Maria nodded. "I understand." Ethan realized something then. This was no longer about charity. This was about choice. Later that afternoon, Ethan stepped outside to split firewood. The physical labor grounded him, gave his hands something to do while his thoughts wandered. The air smelled cleaner now, pine and snowmelt mixing into something sharp and alive. He worked steadily, muscle memory guiding him. Each swing of the axe landed true, the crack of wood echoing briefly before being swallowed by the forest. Behind him, footsteps crunched softly in the snow. Maria stood a few feet away, watching him. She held her coat tighter around herself, the cold still clinging stubbornly to her bones. "You don't have to do that," she said. "We can help." Ethan shook his head. "Kids should rest." She nodded, then surprised him by asking, "Why here?" He paused, resting the axe against the stump. "Why Vermont?" she clarified. "Why this place?" He considered his answer carefully. "After I left the Navy," he said, "I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere that didn't ask questions." "And did it work?" "For a while." She studied him, not intrusively, but with genuine interest. "Something happened." "Yes," Ethan said simply. She did not press. Instead, she said, "Whatever it was, you're still here." He looked at her then. "So are you." They shared a brief, understanding silence. Inside the cabin, Sarah prepared to leave. She packed her bag methodically, checking her list twice. Before stepping onto the porch, she turned to Ethan. "You did a good thing," she said. Ethan shrugged. "I did a necessary thing," she smiled faintly. "Sometimes those are the same." As Sarah's Jeep disappeared down the path, the cabin felt quieter again, but not empty. Maria stood near the window, watching the children sit closer to the fire, their faces relaxed in a way Ethan had not seen before. "I won't forget this," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "You don't have to." As evening approached, shadows lengthened across the snow. Ethan added more wood to the fire and watched the flames catch. The cabin settled into a new rhythm, still unfamiliar, but no longer unwelcome. For the first time since the war, Ethan realized something unsettling and strangely comforting. This place had not been waiting for silence. It had been waiting for people. And now that they were here, he wasn't sure he wanted them to leave. The night settled gently this time. There was no storm pressing at the walls, no wind demanding entry. Snow fell in thin, patient lines, barely audible as it touched the roof and the porch. The forest beyond the cabin stood still, dark shapes layered against the sky, as if listening. Inside, the children slept early. Their exhaustion was no longer the desperate kind, the kind born of fear and hunger, but the deep, honest fatigue that followed safety. They lay on blankets near the hearth, bodies loose, faces unguarded. Even the oldest boy, who rarely let himself rest fully, had surrendered to sleep. Maria watched them for a long time. She sat at the small table, hands wrapped around a mug of warm water Sarah had left behind. Her shoulders were finally relaxed, but her mind was not. Relief, she had learned, often arrived hand in hand with doubt. Across the room, Ethan worked quietly at the counter, cleaning the few dishes they had used. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if any sudden motion might break the fragile calm. The firelight caught the lines of his face, deepening the creases around his eyes, the faint scar along his jaw. Maria studied him in silence. There was something restrained about him, something held back with constant effort. He was kind, she could see that now, but it was not an easy kindness. It had edges, weight. It felt earned. "You don't sleep much," she said softly. Ethan paused, then shrugged. "I do, just not all at once." She nodded, understanding more than he expected. "I used to be able to," she said. "Before." "Before what?" "Before I learned that everything can change overnight." Ethan set the dish down and leaned against the counter. "Yeah," he said. "That'll do it." They fell quiet again. The fire cracked once, sending a small burst of sparks upward. Maria took a breath. "I keep thinking I should leave," she said. Ethan looked at her. "Why?" "Because staying feels dangerous," she replied honestly. "Not because of you, because if I stay, it means admitting we need help." Ethan considered that. "Needing help isn't the same as being helpless." Maria smiled faintly. "It feels that way when you've spent a long time convincing yourself otherwise." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that too well. He glanced toward the sleeping children, then back at Maria. "You don't have to decide tonight." "I know," she said. "But I can feel the decision waiting." The words lingered between them, heavy and unfinished. Later, when the cabin had gone still and Maria had finally allowed herself to lie down beside her children, Ethan stepped outside. The cold greeted him immediately, sharp but clean. He stood on the porch, hands resting on the railing, breathing in the scent of pine and snow. Above him, the sky had cleared enough to reveal a scattering of stars, distant, indifferent, steady. He hadn't meant to think about the past. It came anyway. There was another night, years ago, under a very different sky. The heat had been relentless then, pressing down from all sides. Dust clung to everything: skin, gear, thoughts. The mission had gone wrong early, communications breaking down just as the situation turned unstable. Ethan remembered the sound of shouting, the confusion, the way training took over when fear threatened to interfere. They had been moving civilians out of a collapsed structure when the second blast hit. The memory remained sharp despite his efforts to dull it. The impact, the pressure, the way the world narrowed to immediate tasks: assess, move, stabilize. He remembered kneeling beside a man pinned under debris, blood pooling faster than he could stop it. "You're going to be okay," Ethan had said. He had meant it. The man had smiled faintly, trusting him without question. He had died minutes later. Ethan had carried that moment with him ever since. Not the chaos, not the violence, but the look in that man's eyes, the certainty, the belief that someone else could hold the outcome steady. On the porch, Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He had left the Navy soon after, told himself he was done with decisions that carried that kind of weight, told himself solitude was safer, for him and for anyone unlucky enough to get close. And yet, the door had opened anyway. Footsteps sounded softly behind him. Maria stood in the doorway, wrapped in her coat, hair loose now around her shoulders. She looked smaller in the night air, but no less steady. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Me neither," Ethan replied. They stood side by side, not touching, but close enough to share warmth. "You ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Regret what?" "Opening the door." Ethan thought about the question, really thought about it. "No," he said finally. "I regret how long it stayed closed before." Maria absorbed that quietly. "I keep thinking about what comes next," she said. "School, work, doctors, questions I don't have answers to." Ethan nodded. "Those things matter." "And you?" she asked. "What comes next for you?" He hesitated. For years the answer had been simple. Nothing. More of the same. Quiet. Distance. Survival without expectation. Now the answer felt less certain. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know this. I don't want to pretend this didn't happen." Maria looked at him then, really looked, at the man who had chosen not to send them away, at the weight he carried without complaint. "Neither do I," she said. They stood in silence again, watching the snow fall. When Maria returned inside, Ethan remained on the porch a moment longer. He realized something as the cold crept back into his bones. He had thought he came here to escape memory. Instead, memory had followed him and waited patiently for him to stop running. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low but steady. The children slept. Maria curled protectively around them. The space felt different now, marked not just by survival, but by intention. Ethan closed the door behind him and leaned against it, the quiet settling deep in his chest. He understood finally that the things we carry back from the past do not always come to weigh us down. Sometimes, they come to show us what we are still capable of holding. The morning arrived clear, not bright, not triumphant, but honest. The sky above the cabin had shed its heavy gray, leaving behind a pale blue that felt almost tentative, as if unsure whether it was welcome yet. Sunlight filtered through the trees in thin bands, catching on the snow and turning it into something softer, less threatening. Ethan woke before anyone else. It was habit, more than intention. His body still remembered years when mornings came with orders and expectations. He lay still for a moment, listening. The cabin breathed quietly around him. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing faintly, patient as ever. He heard the children first, not voices, movement. Small feet shifting under blankets. A soft cough, the rustle of fabric. These were sounds of life continuing, unremarkable and therefore precious. Ethan sat up slowly and looked across the room. Maria was awake, sitting upright now, her back against the wall, her eyes following the steady rise and fall of her youngest son's chest. There was no panic in her posture this morning, only focus, care, a readiness that did not come from fear, but from acceptance. She noticed Ethan watching and gave him a small nod. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he replied. They did not rush into conversation. There was no need. Some mornings asked to be allowed to settle before being named. The children woke one by one, blinking at the light, stretching cautiously, as if uncertain whether comfort would still be there when they reached for it. Maria helped them sit up, checking faces, hands, foreheads. Her movements were calm now, practiced without urgency. The youngest boy stirred last. He opened his eyes slowly, confusion flickering across his face. He shifted, then winced slightly, making a small sound of protest. Maria was at his side instantly. "Hey," she said softly. "Easy, you're okay." He looked at her, really looked, as if confirming something. Then his gaze drifted to Ethan, standing, a few feet away, watching quietly. "Where are we?" the boy asked, his voice thin but present. Ethan answered before Maria could. "Somewhere warm." The boy considered that, then nodded once, satisfied. That felt like a victory. Breakfast was simple again, soup, bread, water warmed carefully. The children ate slowly, without the frantic hunger of the days before. Ethan noticed how they watched him now, not with fear, not even with guarded hope, but with familiarity. It unsettled him in a way he could not quite name. Afterward, Maria stepped outside with Ethan. The air was sharp but clean, carrying the scent of pine and thawing snow. The porch creaked softly beneath their weight. The world beyond the cabin felt open again, no longer pressing inward. "I made a call last night," Maria said. Ethan turned toward her. "To who?" "A friend," she replied. "From before everything went wrong." "And?" "She said there's work in town, not much, but steady. And a place. We could stay once the roads are clear." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's good." "It is," she agreed. Then she hesitated. "But it won't be today. Or tomorrow." "No," he said. "It won't." She looked at him carefully. "You're okay with that?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ethan said. "I am." Maria studied his face, perhaps searching for regret. She found none. Instead, she saw resolve, quiet, unspoken, but firm. "Then we'll stay," she said, "until it makes sense not to." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest at the words, not relief exactly, recognition. Later that morning, Sarah arrived. Her Jeep climbed the path more easily this time, tires crunching over packed snow. She stepped out with a bag slung over her shoulder, her auburn hair pulled back against the cold. In daylight, her freckles stood out clearly against her fair skin, her expression open and alert. She knelt beside the boy immediately, checking his pulse, his temperature, his breathing. Her hands moved with confidence born of repetition, but her eyes softened as she worked. "He's improving," she said finally. "Still fragile, but improving." Maria let out a breath she had been holding too long. Sarah stood and turned to Ethan. "You've done well," she said. He shook his head. "We all did." She smiled faintly at that. They talked logistics then, follow-up visits, supplies, next steps. Sarah was practical, clear, unromantic about the process. Recovery, she reminded them, was not a straight line. Before she left, Sarah pulled Ethan aside. "You know," she said quietly, "you didn't just help them." Ethan looked at her. "I know." That was enough. The day unfolded slowly. The children ventured outside for the first time, boots sinking into the snow, laughter breaking free in short bursts before caution pulled it back. Maria watched them from the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, her face turned toward the sun. Ethan joined her, handing her a mug of warm tea. "They look different," she said. "They feel different," he replied. She smiled then, really smiled. It surprised them both. That afternoon, Ethan found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He made plans, not detailed ones, not promises, just small considerations, extra firewood, space on the shelf, a routine that included more than one heartbeat. As evening approached, the cabin glowed warmly against the darkening trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, steady and unhurried. Inside, the children slept again, full and safe. Maria moved quietly among them, adjusting blankets, checking on her youngest one last time before sitting down. Ethan watched her. "You know," she said, without looking up, "I used to think home was a place you passed through." He raised an eyebrow. "And now?" "Now, I think it's a place that holds you," she said. "Even when you don't know how to hold yourself." Ethan nodded slowly. "That sounds right." That night, when the fire burned low and the cabin settled into its familiar quiet, Ethan lay awake, not from vigilance, but from awareness. He was not alone, and for the first time that fact did not feel like something he needed to survive. It felt like something he could grow into. Outside, snow fell lightly, erasing old tracks, softening the world. Inside, a door that had once closed against everything remained open, not to the storm, but to what came after. Ethan closed his eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of breathing around him. The war was still part of him. The past still spoke. But here, in this place, with these people, it no longer decided everything. Sometimes survival was not about enduring the cold. Sometimes it was about choosing to stay. Sometimes God's miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire. They don't come wrapped in certainty or easy answers. Sometimes they come quietly. In the form of a door opened on the worst night of winter, a stranger who chooses compassion over comfort, or a mother who keeps walking when every reason tells her to stop. Faith doesn't always mean being rescued from the storm. Sometimes, faith means believing that someone will open the door, or having the courage to open it yourself. In our everyday lives, we all face moments like that cabin door, a chance to help when it's inconvenient, a choice to love when it's risky, an opportunity to show mercy when no one would blame us for turning away. And maybe that's where God works most often. Not in grand miracles, but in ordinary people choosing kindness again and again, even when they are tired, even when they are afraid. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may be walking through their own storm. Leave a comment below about a moment when kindness changed your life, or when you felt God's presence in an unexpected way. And if you believe that no mother, no child, and no broken soul should ever face the cold alone, subscribe to this channel for more stories of hope, faith, and second chances. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you through every storm you face. May your home be filled with warmth, your heart with courage, and may you always find a light waiting when the night feels longest. Amen.